Welcome back, Night Owls. This is Dr. Nighttime. In this video, I'm going to go through my top 10 tips for how to make the most out of your tutoring sessions. Number 10, and this is a pretty simple one, just read the terms of service of whatever tutoring source you're working through, whether it's my own site or any other. I do occasionally need to have an awkward conversation with a student or a client who hasn't read the terms of service, and so it's just little things like a student needing to cancel at the last minute and then realizing that there might be a cancellation fee associated with that. And so it's a small thing. There's a reason why it's not that high up on the list. But just do read the terms of service and make sure that you're okay with the terms of what you're agreeing to. Number 9. Going into your session, explicitly state the course expectations and any deadlines associated with it. Not all courses that bear a similar name are actually analogous courses. Also, if you have a midterm coming up, make sure that your tutor knows about that. If your final exams are earlier or later than most students, make sure your tutor knows about that. And for the most part, make sure that your tutor knows what is or isn't being covered in the class and what deadlines are appropriate. Number 8, let your tutor contact your instructor. This helps with point number 9. Obviously, so I talked about how students should let the tutor know what is or isn't being covered. Other questions about, are there these possible directions that some instructors go in, and some will cover this detail, others won't, and all that. A lot of those are most easily resolved by allowing the tutor to contact the instructor. In fact, if you sign up with Dr. Nighttime, you can't even sign in to set up an initial consultation without providing your instructor's contact info, assuming that's applicable, right? If you're an adult learner just studying for the GRE or something, there might not necessarily be an associated instructor. There's a separate page for that, but for the most part, let your tutor contact your instructor. I personally will not reveal you, the students, your identity to the instructor. I will insist my students request some privacy, and there's not really much reason for the instructor to know which students I'm working with, but for little questions about what is or isn't covered, what is or isn't being emphasized in the class, it always helps for the tutor to be able to contact the instructor. Now, once the tutor is contacting the instructor, this does mean there's one important thing to be careful of. Don't cheat. Tutoring is not contract cheating. Contract cheating is when you pay someone to help you cheat in school. I don't do that, at least not knowingly. And to put it bluntly, if a student tricks me into providing unauthorized help and I catch wind of what was going on, I will notify the appropriate instructor or dean of students or whoever it is I need to contact to try to correct any incorrect grades. I've only actually ever needed to do that once. It is, without a doubt, the least pleasant aspect of this job, tutoring. But just don't do it. Don't put me in an awkward situation. And again, if you signed up with me and you know that I'm in contact with your instructor, don't do anything stupid. Now, if you're unsure about whether something is honest or not, I'll never get mad or get anyone in trouble for asking, are you comfortable with this, that, or the other? As long as I haven't been tricked into providing unauthorized assistance, there's no need for me to escalate the situation. And often there is something of a gray area. If there's a graded assignment you've been given without explicit instructions about whether or not you're allowed to collaborate with people who are already familiar with the course material, that is a bit of a judgment call as to what a tutor can or can't advise you on. And it's a judgment call that I'd have to make on a case-by-case basis, depending on things like whether or not I think something would be obvious to you if only pointed out, and the like. But, so, short version, it's okay to ask if I'm comfortable with doing something. Just don't try to trick me into anything. Number 6, give yourself enough time to patch up missing prerequisites. So, if you're pursuing any sort of STEM field in college, as you're well aware, certain courses will presume knowledge of previous courses. Now, presuming knowledge of previous courses, in theory, means you took the course so you should know what's in it. In practice, what that means is you took the course at least a semester ago. You knew it at least well enough to get a passing grade. That doesn't necessarily mean that if you were to take the course now, 1 or more semesters later, you'd still get a passing grade in that material. I know this. This is not, it's not a problem. While this is going to present some difficulty for you in the class, it's not a problem that we can't work through, as long as you're realistic about the amount of time it would take to develop that familiarity with the underlying material that you probably don't have a perfect memory of. So, again, if you're struggling in a class because the professor is explaining stuff assuming you remember stuff from a previous class and you don't remember it that well, that's okay. We can work through that. But don't expect instant understanding of an entire semester of material in a 1 to 2 hour session. Number 5, make sure the help you need is conducive to tutoring. And there are a number of considerations for that. First of all, make sure that the course that you're taking, to put it bluntly, is one that you're actually qualified to take. I know I talked before about patching gaps in your prerequisite knowledge. Very rarely, but it has happened, I've had students with such a missing gap in prerequisite knowledge that I seriously suspected some sort of academic dishonesty for that student to be placed in the class. One particular incident I remember involved a student taking a physics course, the calculus-based physics course for engineers, was looking at some of the more complicated topics in the course, and in this calculus-based course, this student could not calculate the derivative of functions like x squared or sine of x. And when I tried to break down the physics aspects into simpler cases, couldn't correctly identify answers to questions like, if you kick the wall and your foot applies a 10 Newton force to the wall, what force does the wall apply to your foot? If you haven't taken the calculus-based physics class or any sort of physics class, just know that those topics are so fundamental. One of them necessary for the prereq, the other, if you haven't been understanding that, then you clearly have not been studying at all in the course. And so if you're looking for help in that, with such a gap between your own level of knowledge and what the course demands, then that's not something that tutoring can fix. Another situation that is considerably less obvious. Occasionally I have students requesting help in something that's supposed to cover multiple years of study. Particularly, I've had a couple of students studying for the SAT, saying, I have the SAT next month. Can you teach me SAT math? And my thought there is that's sort of like going up to a veterinarian and saying, "Can you tell me about cats?" Yes, given enough time, the veterinarian can tell you an awful lot about cats. However, given the short amount of time, you have to narrow down what you wanted to know about into something that a tutor could actually help you with. Version, not all academic struggles are ones that tutoring is the best option for. Number 4, don't expect an impromptu lecture to work out very well. What an impromptu lecture is when a student, for whatever reason, didn't really get much out of the lecture that his or her professor tried to give, and is requesting that I, at a moment's notice, give a lecture on a topic that I hadn't been primed on. A student wants to know about this topic without any real background on it, just wants to learn this essentially for the first time. If I have to come up with something like that at a moment's notice, it's not going to be the best of lectures. Now, at the same time, if you're going to ask that I prepare something in advance, looking at my site, if you look at the pricing page, I do request compensation for that time as well, and so make sure you're okay with that as well. And if you want to just go for the impromptu lecture on its own without paying for any prior preparation, okay, yeah, that's you don't always need to pay for the pay the most amount of money for the absolute best version of something, but just be aware of that. Number 3, official practice problems are the best, but your tutor can come up with some instead, and those should still be pretty good. What do I mean by official practice problems? I mean anything that comes from the actual, any practice problems that are generated by or recommended by whoever is in charge of this topic. That would either be if your instructor comes up with a homework assignment. That would be good to practice on for your upcoming exam. If you're studying for a standardized exam, looking at anything that that whoever's in charge of that exam has released, or previous versions of that exam, which I know for the AP you can get the written answer questions to previous AP exams for free. You just Google it and they come up. Those are, I would say, the best problems to practice on because they have the appropriate difficulty, focus, or balance of what they ask about when, and length of time to spend on each problem. That being said, right, so obviously that's going to be the best to go over, and if you practice on a bunch and you have these few that you're getting stuck on, okay. If you don't have access to such a good list, and you want the tutor to come up with some, those also work pretty well. The downside there is that you're getting the most for your money if you've had the opportunity to work through these problems first, and only need to spend time talking to your tutor about the ones you have issues with. But in real time, if you're just going through trying to solve some and you get stuck and your tutor provides you some pointers to say, now don't forget about this factor, yeah, that still works really well. But again, official problems are even better. Number 2, make sure your learning style matches your tutor's teaching style. And I share this story with a number of my students. Back when I was in college, I was studying mechanical engineering, and as it turned out, the professor I had for systems dynamics and control systems, her teaching style differed so heavily from my learning style. I was typically in the top half of my class, but I was consistently near the bottom of her classes. And so it wasn't that I was a bad student. I was doing well enough in my other classes, and it wasn't that she was a bad teacher. My classmates were doing just fine in the course. I was the one who was struggling. It was just that there was a mismatch. And that sometimes happens. A couple of incidents that come to mind of students that I met with once, and the student decided not to work with me again, and that was understandable given the extent to which I wasn't supplying the best information or the best approach for what that student wanted. I had a physics student who was taking a calculus-based physics course, and the problems were specifically designed so that you couldn't just plug into the formulas you had memorized. You actually had to apply several of these formulas in sequence and realize this one gets me that variable, then I plug that one into here, then that one into there. And I couldn't quickly enough realize that what the student was looking for was an answer to which formula do I use, and that the questions that the student was going to be facing in his class were not conducive to that approach, and showing him that, demonstrating that, and helping him see how to get from his mindset of I can't use one formula on this whole thing, but what sequence of formulas can I use? And I've thought about that encounter for in the year and a half since it's happened, and I'd like to think that means I would be better positioned to help that student if I met with a similar student today. But at the time, given the student's approach and the questions that were being asked, none of what I was saying at the time was going to help him. And so we had one session, and he decided to find another tutor, and that's part of the beauty of private tutoring. You can shop around, and if your first experience with a tutor you don't feel like you're learning very much from, feel free to look for someone else. And that includes if you sign up with me and you just don't feel like my approach is something that is helping you understand what to do. Yeah, find someone else. I'm not going to claim to be the best tutor for absolutely everyone. Another instance I had was there was a calculus student I was working with a few months ago, again, or I worked with once a few months ago, and she was going over some limit questions, and I had learned the rules of limits, like multiplying by a scalar and such, or limit of a sum of two functions. And I was asking, can we go over problems with, and she'd named the rule of the limit. And I was just kind of flustered and a little confused, because if you know which rule you're going to need to use before you even start working on the question, that's going to kind of give you an unfair hint. I say unfair, I mean, the hint of knowing which rule you're about to need to use, that's not one that you're going to have when you're actually taking the exam. She had an exam about a week later. And the piece that I hadn't put together yet was that this was a student who, it was her first time in a college-level math class, and that a lot of high schools will cater their questions to clearly testing the knowledge of a specific set of rules, leading students to commit a set of rules to memory, and feeling like as long as they know those rules, they can solve the problems because they'll be able to quickly identify which one rule is being used. Whereas in this more advanced course, it was clear that there were going to be, you'd have to use a combination of rules, or it would not be obvious which rule to use. And I didn't identify that and say, well, here's why it wouldn't be the best for me to tell you which rule to use to solve a problem before I tell you what the problem is. Because on the exam, right, you're not going to know which rule to use. And that just led to it was like we were having two halves of two different tutoring sessions, and the connection just wasn't there, and that student worked with me exactly once. I'd like to think personally that I've grown my ability to adapt my approach to different students, but again, make sure that your tutor is someone who can explain it in a way that is helpful to you, and if not, feel free to find another tutor. And the number one best piece of advice I have for students trying to make the most of their sessions is actively participate in the conversation. The huge benefit, or the biggest benefit, to tutoring as opposed to classroom teaching is that the tutor and student can have a conversation about the topic. That lessons are not something that the instructor does and the student watches. The student is a much more active participant in learning. It means that I, the tutor, have a better sense of what I don't need to talk about because you already understood it the first time, what I need to go over a couple of times, what I might talk about for some students for a more subtle concept that might make up the hardest question on the exam, but really for a particular student it wouldn't be a good idea to confuse that student and ensure that that student might not get a perfect score on the exam, but that student isn't going to do that well. That's a judgment call I need to make sometimes. I can get a much better sense of what's worth spending time on if my student is actively participating in the conversation. If I find that the conversation is too one-sided and that I'm just talking about approaches to a problem and the student's just kind of trying to take it in, and I prompt some questions and I don't know, well then I end up feeling like I need to go through stuff awfully slowly. And it leads to some missed opportunities as to what could be covered in that time. But yeah, so number one biggest piece of advice, just take advantage of the fact that you can have a conversation with your tutor, you can ask questions, you can say, wait, I didn't understand this one bit. You can say, can I apply this idea to something like this? All of that is a great way to help you get the most out of your sessions. As always, if you like the way I explain things and want to arrange private lessons, click the link in the description below. And until next time, this is Dr. Nighttime wishing you a good night.